The situation on the Pokrovsk front, Gripen fighter jets for Ukraine, and strikes on military targets deep inside the Russian Federation. This is the war map on freedom. I'm Oli Borisov, hello. Let's start our overview with the Pokrovsk direction. This is where the fiercest fighting is happening, according to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. The situation remains difficult as the Russians have greater numbers and continue so-called local assaults. Fighting is being reported near the settlements of Rodinsk and Myrnared, Lysivka, Zverov, Kotlina. The General Staff also reported that Ukrainian defenders managed to liberate two settlements, Kucherov Yar and Suketsky. The fighting continues. Next, let's discuss the situation in the Lyman direction. Ukrainian defenders from the 425th Separate Assault Regiment Skelia cleared the settlement of Turetsky of occupiers in the Lyman direction. This was reported on the unit's Facebook page. The Russians' goal is to reach the Oskil River, but the occupiers have not been able to do so. Fighting is being recorded in the areas of the settlements of Drobesheva, Stavki, and Kolodyazi. The Ukrainian armed forces are successfully repelling attacks and holding back the enemy, according to the General Staff. Next, let's talk about the Kupiansk direction. Here, the occupiers' army is trying to advance actively in several directions. The attacks are being repelled, including with the use of drones. The General Staff reports fighting in the area of populated areas: Malaya Shepkovka, Petropavlovka, Peskany. Earlier, the American Institute for the Study of War reported that the Ukrainian armed forces were successfully counterattacking in the Kupian direction. This once again demonstrates the inability of the Russians to take over the positions of the Ukrainian armed forces. And then we will discuss the situation in the Volchansk direction. Ukraine State Border Guard Service shared a video of the Ukrainian drone vampire in action. These are the so-called drops. With a precise hit, they destroyed the occupiers' positions where they stored ammunition. Enemy forest belts are also targeted by Ukrainian UAVs. Border guards from the Forpost Brigade reported that as a result of their successful operations, the occupiers' logistics have been disrupted, which significantly slows down their offensive potential. We will discuss this and other topics with military and political analyst Dmytro Snihyriev. Dmitry, hello. The General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine reported the liberation of two settlements in the Pokrovsk direction. These are Kucherov Yar and Suketskoy. But the occupying army is trying hard to capture it. Pokrovsk, and to no avail. What kind of Russian losses are we talking about here, given their local assaults?
It should be noted that since August 2025, 9 settlements have been deoccupied in the Pokrovsk direction. Stabilization measures have been carried out in these settlements. The total area liberated from the Russian occupiers is about 200 square kilometers. As for the losses, according to reports from the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, just in the last 10 days in the Pokrovsk-Dobropilya direction, about 1,756 Russian servicemen and 75 pieces of equipment have been destroyed. It should also be noted that over 2 months of fighting in the Dobropilya and Pokrovsk directions, the total losses of the Russian occupation forces, that's about 16,000 personnel. And the number of Russian occupiers' armored vehicles destroyed by Ukraine's defense forces is staggering. The total number is about 1,400 units. Of these, 36 are tanks, and there are about 121 armored fighting vehicles. There are 162 artillery systems and about 1,000 units of automotive and motor vehicles. That's about 450 vehicles and around 500 units. These are ATVs and motorcycles. So as we can see, the losses of the Russian occupiers are enormous, even for the army of the occupying country. Moreover, the occupying forces themselves are forced to admit that the so-called assault groups are now suffering massive personnel losses. And we're talking about a shortage of about 40 to 50%. And it's quite telling that the so-called 500ths, that is, refusers, and even lightly wounded soldiers of the occupying army are being sent to the assault groups. This, in turn, is evidence that there are major problems with personnel. I should also note that the average lifespan of an assault trooper is about 12 days. And this points to the significant successes of Ukraine's defense forces, particularly in their use of so-called tactics, such as the drone wall, and accordingly, the conduct of counter-sabotage and counter-offensive operations.
A representative of the GUR, Vadim Skibitsky, said that Ukraine is capable of striking Russian military targets at distances of more than 1,500 kilometers. Let's listen to Mr. Skibitsky's direct statement and discuss in more detail.
We have plans. We are trying to strike the most critical targets. And the results of our work on oil refineries and fuel storage facilities are obvious. If we look at it in percentage terms, then as of today, the results achieved by our defense forces against oil refineries are the highest we've had throughout the entire war. Drones are capable of striking targets 1,500 kilometers away and beyond in order to destroy key facilities on Russian territory that support military operations. Vadim Skibitsky, representative of the main intelligence directorate. And
here's the interesting thing. Is Putin really that scared by this, considering the map published online showing that air defense systems are being pulled in from all over Russia, specifically to defend Moscow?
Yes, it scares him. Moreover, Putin fully understands the capabilities of strike drones and the special operations forces of the main intelligence directorate of the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. And let me remind you, a drone from the main intelligence directorate of the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense has set a record for striking targets on the territory of the occupying country. That's about 2,000 kilometers. Oil refineries in Ukta. Similarly, strikes were carried out on oil refineries in Tumen as well. The distance is also over 2,000 kilometers. Moreover, the Russian dictator is well aware that this has increased accordingly. Not only the range for hitting targets, but also, accordingly, the tactical and technical characteristics. That is, successful strikes by drones of the main intelligence directorate, the Ministry of Defense, and the Special Operations Forces. I would note that the state of air defense systems both in Crimea and on the territory of the occupier's country demonstrates the complete helplessness of Russian air defenses. Moreover, the radar systems of the Russian occupiers are being destroyed. And it's quite telling that. In recent days, fighters from the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine have destroyed 2 enemy Nebo radar systems and a Buk surface-to-air missile system as well. And it's very telling that. At this moment, Ukraine's defense forces and intelligence community are systematically working to deplete the Russian air defense system, specifically in terms of covering legitimate military targets both in the temporarily occupied regions of Ukraine and, accordingly, in the Russian Federation. And the clearest proof of this: the results of drone strikes by the Special Operations Forces of the main intelligence directorate of Ukraine's Ministry of Defense on oil refining facilities in Russia, according to the Russian side itself, have partially or completely halted the operations of 38% of Russian oil refineries. And let me point out, colleagues, that the reaction of the Russian dictator is no coincidence. Let me remind you, these are drone strikes by the main intelligence directorate of Ukraine's Ministry of Defense on one of the most heavily protected sites, namely the government residences in Crimea. Specifically, these were strikes on the residence in Foros, which has a layered air defense system. And I should note, at the time of Putin's visit to Sochi, similar air raid alerts were sounding, which naturally affected the mood of the Russian dictator. He fully understands that the capabilities of the Ukrainian side, not just with drones, but also the intelligence community's ability to obtain real-time information about the whereabouts of the top officials of the occupying country, are quite significant. And let me remind you, there have been successful operations involving eliminations in real time. War criminals on the territory of the Russian Federation, including with the use of strike drones. This concerns both the military command of the occupying country's army and, accordingly, collaborators. That's why these sentiments are present. And I should point out, air defense systems are even being pulled in from the Russian interior. Specifically, Arctic Tor systems have been spotted, which were transferred to the Moscow region to create the appearance of a layered defense. Recently, a map was published showing the deployment of air defense systems by the Russian occupiers in Moscow and the Moscow region. Let me note, there are S-300s, S-400s, Panzers, Tors, basically everything that the Russian Federation was able to scrape together from the far corners of this vast country. Why scrape together? Because at the moment, the capabilities of the Russian military-industrial complex to produce the latest air defense systems are limited. This is evidenced by the Russian side statement that they are ready to buy back their own systems from Turkey, the S-400s that were previously sold. And the second very telling point is that the Russian Federation has once again extended its contract with India for the supply of S-400 air defense systems until 2027. Let me remind you, dear viewers, and especially addressing Russians, that the contract originally stipulated the delivery of 5 S-400 units by 2023. So, what we're talking about is that all the statements by the Russian dictator about the Russian military-industrial complex working for shifts, along with the increased production of the latest and most advanced strike weapons and modern air defense systems, these are, in essence, nothing more than political statements that have no real or substantial basis and actually reflect, or even highlight, a decline in overall economic growth. Break time equals 0.5s/. Ukraine already, at this point in time, break time equals 0.5s/. The period of time that will occur after the current year, which is commonly referred to as next year, is when events and plans that are scheduled for the future will take place.
May receive Gripen fighter jets. Tell us about their advantages and where they could be useful.
Let me point out, dear viewers, that while there was previously talk about the possible delivery of outdated Gripens, now, after the joint press conference of the Ukrainian president and, accordingly, the Swedish political leadership, we're talking about the latest generation of Gripens. This is the so-called Gripen E. In other words, these are the newest models. These are the aircraft that will be supplied to the Ukrainian side, and what's impressive is the number that will be provided for the needs of the armed forces of Ukraine, between 120 and 150 units. What's notable is that the Gripen is, let's say, low maintenance, unlike the F-16. It can use as a runway, a very limited space, about 500 meters in length. So it can take off from a forward operating base as well as, accordingly, even from highways. What's also notable is that the Gripen doesn't require the same technical conditions for runways as the F-16 does. It's not sensitive to them, unlike the American jet. Another very telling point. The Gripen's engine can even be replaced in the field in just 2 to 3 hours at most. So, what we're talking about is that this aircraft, in terms of price-to-quality ratio, offers unique capabilities for Ukraine's defense forces. Plus, the Gripens have been modified to work with the long-range radar aircraft already supplied by the Swedish side, and for target detection. We're talking about Swedish SAB, about AWACS aircraft made by Saab, the same company that manufactures the Gripen. So this is the main point of the contract signed by the Ukrainian president with the Swedish side. In other words, the Gripens will work together with the long-range radar aircraft for target detection. Plus, of course, the Gripens themselves. The latest E-class models can use, accordingly, the newest weapons, primarily air-to-air missiles, which are already familiar to both the Russian occupiers and, of course, to our pilots when it comes to taking down Russian aircraft. Let me remind you, the Russian Sukhoi, it was with these very missiles that we managed to shoot it down in the skies over the Kursk region. So all this combined data makes it clear, first and foremost to the Russian side, that Ukrainian air defense will be strengthened, both in terms of countering the enemy's aerodynamic and aeroballistic weapons, and, most importantly, in enhancing our ability to strike legitimate military targets on the territory of the occupying country. That is, those very American era missiles with a range of up to 450 kilometers, combined with the Swedish Gripens, this will create enormous problems for the Russian Federation. And let me remind you, the United States has announced the delivery of about 3,300 ERMs. All of this creates the conditions for, let's put it this way, cautious optimism regarding the increased capabilities of Ukraine's air defense forces and, accordingly, the Ukrainian Air Force when it comes to striking military targets both in the temporarily occupied regions of Ukraine and, first and foremost, on the territory of the Russian Federation.
Dmitry, thank you so much for taking the time to join us live. Dmitry Snigarev, military and political analyst, was with us live. Let me also remind you that you can find all the latest information about the situation at the front on our YouTube channel Freedom and Telegram channel Freedom. Our editors promptly update the news feed. Thank you for your trust, and see you next time.
Subscribe to UATV English and stay updated on the most important events, top news from Ukraine and all over the world, in-depth analysis, exclusive reports and interviews, all on hand in our channel. Join our community of viewers and stay tuned.